Harriet Brawne, and I'm a brand marketing manager at JBS Southern, specifically for the Southern division, where I look after a portfolio of premium beef and lamb brands sold across Australia and into export markets, namely the 3 markets that we went into. I'm very passionate about this industry and the end product, just as much as I care about how we talk about it and communicate the products we have. In March this year, I joined the ICMJ Asia Tour and spent 2 weeks in Japan, China, and Indonesia in supermarkets, wet markets, processing plants, abattoirs, and premium retail environments. Today, I want to talk about 3 things, but firstly, sort of the overarching theme will be about what consumers want to know and a lesson from storytelling in Asia. So there's 3 things that I want to talk about today. The first is the role of positioning, why it matters right now, and what Australia's real story is on shelf. Second is about our on-pack claims, what the best labels we saw in market were doing and what we can learn from them. And then thirdly, the role of broader marketing. So how do we then deepen this story past the pack? So when I think about how Australian beef is positioned in Asian markets, the phrase that comes up most consistently for me is clean and green, or sometimes lean and green. So we're known to be safe, natural, and trustworthy. That was backed up by some of the things that we saw in market. You can see a few photos on the slide deck I have. So when we walked through the supermarkets in Tokyo, Shanghai, and Jakarta, I could see that positioning at work. But what I kept noticing was the gap between what that positioning communicates and what Australian beef actually is. Clean and green definitely answers one question. Is the product safe? Absolutely. But it doesn't answer necessarily what makes our Australian product different and special, what makes it worth paying more for than some of the South American product that we're now seeing come into those markets. And then as well, of course, US product in those markets as well. So I came home thinking about that gap quite a lot. So looking at the competitive landscape, the pressure is not coming, it really is already here. Part of what made the tour so valuable was seeing the product sort of in that context, not in isolation or hearing about it from a third party. Sort of seeing everything next to it, seeing all of the products from all of the different countries next to everything else on the shelf. Japan and the United States have clarity in their positioning that I found like really interesting and sort of different to how we communicate our supply chain. The USDA grading framework is nationwide and consumer facing. The consumer doesn't necessarily need to understand the supply chain behind the product because they can understand what choice, prime, and select is on the shelf. Similar to in the Japanese market, there's really only 2 breeds of cattle, so they don't necessarily need to understand, or if they do, it's really just one supply chain to understand a long-fed, grain-fed supply chain. So then we look at what is coming out of South America. Brazil and Argentinian beef are coming into those markets. They haven't been able to get market access for all 3 markets we've been into, but certainly it is sort of happening at a rapid pace. What we heard from customers and from representatives of industry and government was that they are improving the presentation and their packaging and the story behind their products as well. And it's coming into those markets at a much cheaper price than our Australian products. So in closing that gap in a lot of ways, I think as an Australian industry, we really need to understand how are we going to manage that gap and how are we going to justify our price point. In all 3 of the countries we visited, as I mentioned, the Australian government and the industry representatives in those markets really pressed on us that competitive pressure is already there and it's not coming. So back onto marketing, one thing that really struck me is that marketing really needs to answer simple questions. A couple of the photos here on the slide deck show a US beef ad in action in a Japanese subway and also a Uruguay beef ad in China as well, which was really surprising to see. So in my day-to-day role, I manage brands that are built on provenance. Great Southern, most namely, is positioned around a grass-fed beef and lamb program from Southern Australia. We have the story, we have a great supply chain, and we have great people behind that supply chain as well. We also have Australia's traceability infrastructure. That means the credentials for our traceability are deep and specific. The story does already exist, but being in market reminded me that having that story and telling that story really are two different things. The products that stopped me in Tokyo, Shanghai, and Jakarta were not the ones with the most information on pack necessarily. They were the ones that answered one or two questions with complete clarity, and as a consumer gave me trust in those products. Where does this product come from? How is it raised? What is it going to taste like? Realistically, we've only got a few seconds with our consumers at that pack level. So when we get into the Japanese market specifically, in Japan, the baseline is strong. Australia holds 47% of Japan's beef import volume, which is worth about $2 billion annually to us. We are the dominant imported beef supplier, and that position is hard won and worth protecting. We have a long relationship with the Japanese market. MLA's own consumer research tells us that story clearly. When Japanese consumers think about Australian beef, the first two things that come to mind are that it is guaranteed safe to eat and that it is fresh. Reassurance claims, delicious and family favourite, come further down the list. We also saw marble score used consistently effectively as an eating quality shorthand in that market. Consumers do really understand it, and they use that to make their purchase decisions. Interestingly, anecdotally, we were told by a fair few Japanese customers that Japanese consumers are actually shying away from the highly marbled A5 product because of its very rich taste and texture, which is quite interesting. Now going into China, the Aussie beef mark had genuine recognition across every format we visited. The Aussie beef logo was well represented in that market. Brand awareness was doing real work before any conversation sort of started, but national branding really was carrying most of that weight. You can see in some photos to the left that we do see some branding in that market, but ultimately it was more about the Aussie beef mark. When affluent Chinese shoppers are standing in front of a beef counter, the number one piece of information they're looking for is the country of origin at 52%, according to MLA data. But right behind it are also eating quality signals. 74% say that Australian beef is actually the most delicious. I think in that market, consumers are really ready for a more complete story and to really understand our Australian products and our Australian supply chains as well. One thing that also struck out for me in that market was sort of the miseducation or misunderstanding about grass-fed, which obviously relates directly to my role, but I think we can be doing a better job of sort of explaining and educating some of those terms that we work with on a day-to-day basis. And we do need to find a way to continue to tell our story in that market. Now into Indonesia. Indonesia is definitely the market that I've probably thought about the most since coming home. 79% of Indonesian consumers are worried about their household budgets right now. Price density is very real in that market. Conversely, though, Australian boxed beef exports have reached a record high there, and there is a genuine premiumisation trend that is happening in the Greater Jakarta area. Both things are true at the same time. Australian beef has the highest consumer trust rating of any supplier in Indonesia. But also, when you look at that, straight under, coming in fifth of the list is actually that Australia is the perfect place to produce beef, which I think is a very good thing that we need to sort of get into and think about more. Why is Australia the best place to raise beef? That provenance instinct is already in the consumer's mind. MLA's own research notes that Indonesian consumers are increasingly demanding transparency in food production systems, provenance, and verifiable label information. We definitely saw that in some of the retail environments that we visited. Another point for that market is that halal certification is a non-negotiable. That is just part of market access. So before anything else goes on the label, that halal claim needs to be front and center on the shelf. So the pack opens the door, but the brand builds what is behind it. On-pack claims definitely open the door, But if the provenance story only lives on the label and it isn't able to build any kind of brand equity, that premium position over time isn't built, unfortunately. The strongest food brands in the world use the pack as the starting point and build the story out from there, into digital, into social, into the retail and food service environments itself. What I want to do with the brands that I manage is more of that, and more specifically rooted in provenance. Social content showing real farms, real regions, real production systems. Chef and food service partnerships that tell the eating quality story through people's consumers' trust. Retailer activations that bring the origin story off the pack and into the environment. The goal is that by the time a consumer picks up one of our brands, they already know something about it. That pack confirms what they already believe about the product. This trip, seeing our product in context, watching how other countries show up in market, has changed how I think about my own work. Japan and the US have largely solved the consumer confusion problem by simplifying their supply chains. Australia is much more complex than that. We have different breeds, we have different production systems, we have different regions, we have genuinely different eating experiences at different at different price points. That complexity isn't a problem, it's actually what makes our product interesting. But complexity without communication just looks like confusion on shelf. The job of packaging is not to tell the whole story, it is to remove the confusion, give the consumers something clear and honest to hold on to, and let that product do the rest. The Australian red meat industry is not just a safe choice, it is one that it genuinely has one of the most interesting food stories in the world, and I came home more motivated than ever to tell it properly. That is my presentation today.